A vial of blood. A pair of tweezers lifting a 2,000-year-old tooth out of dry Judean soil. Two objects that have nothing to do with each other, except that online, right now, millions of people are being told they're connected. The claim sounds almost too simple to be real. T-hat, if you carry O-positive blood, you're carrying a genetic signature that traces back to the ancient Israelites. Share the post, and someone in the comments will tell you they always felt a pull toward Jerusalem. Someone else will say their grandmother always said their family had old blood. It spreads because it feels like a secret hiding in your own veins. But here's the question. Almost nobody asks before hitting share. What actually happens when you compare a modern blood type to ancient DNA? Is there a real study behind this? And if there is, did it say what the headlines are claiming it said? To answer that, we have to go back to a much less viral, much dustier moment, a laboratory in Tel Aviv, decades before consumer DNA kits existed, when a team of anatomists sat down with 68 sets of human remains and asked a far narrower, far stranger question than the one circulating online today. In 1977, in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, researchers Meckel, Kobliansky, Nathan, Arnsberg, and Nathan, working out of the Department of Anatomy and Anthropology at Tel Aviv University, published a study most people have never heard of. They had access to 68 ancient skeletons excavated from burial sites in and around Jerusalem and En Gedi, dated to roughly 1,600 to 2,000 years old. Remains understood, based on the archaeological context, to belong to Jewish residents of that era. Seeing a laboratory method called hemagglutination inhibition testing, designed to detect blood group markers preserved in ancient tissue, they typed each skeleton for ABO blood group. 55 of the 68 samples were usable, and when the results came back, they didn't point toward O at all. Type A appeared in roughly 31% of the sample, type B in about 15%, type O, the very blood type at the center of today's viral claim, showed up in just 3.6% of the ancient population. The single largest group, more than half of everyone tested, came back as type AB, a blood type that is actually one of the rarest in living populations today. Sit with that for a second, because it's the opposite of what the algorithm wants you to believe. If this ancient sample is even roughly representative, the population it came from was overwhelmingly A, B, and AB, and almost never O. The researchers themselves concluded that this pointed to a high frequency of the genes that produce A and B blood types, and an unusually low occurrence of the O-producing gene in the population these skeletons came from. So before we go any further, we have to be honest about something. The claim driving this video's title, that O-positive blood matches ancient Jewish DNA, runs directly against the one piece of real ancient blood typing data we actually have. That's not a small technicality. That's the headline, breaking apart the moment you touch the actual paper. But don't close the tab yet, because the story doesn't end with the viral claim is wrong. It starts there, because once you ask why people believed this in the first place and what blood type can and can't tell you about ancestry, you end up somewhere far stranger than a Facebook post, somewhere, that involves real geneticists, real ancient tombs, and one of the most carefully studied population histories on the planet. Let's start with the basic biology, because this is where most viral claims about blood and ancestry quietly fall apart. Your ABO blood type is controlled by a single gene, one that comes in three main versions. A, B, and O. You inherit one copy from each parent. If you get an A and an O, you're type A. Get a B and an O, you're type B. Get an A and a B together, you're AB. Get two O copies, you're O. That's it. That's the entire mechanism. It's one gene out of roughly 20,000 in the human genome, and it does one job. It tells your red blood cells which sugar molecules to display on their surface. Now compare that to what population geneticists actually use to trace ancestry. Not one gene, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of genetic markers scattered across your entire genome, plus specialized tools like mitochondrial DNA, which traces your maternal line back through history, and Y-chromosome DNA, which does the same for the paternal line in men. Ancestry is written in the accumulated pattern across your whole genetic code, built up over thousands of generations. Blood type is one switch, flipped one of four ways, and it's been flipped that way independently over and over in wildly unrelated populations across the entire planet. That's the part the viral claim skips. O blood type isn't rare. It's the single most common blood type on Earth, found in large numbers among Irish farmers, Peruvian villagers, West African communities, and Pacific Islanders, groups that share essentially none of the same ancestral history. If a shared blood type meant shared ancestry, half the world would be cousins with the other half. Blood type tells you almost nothing about where your family tree grew. It tells you which sugar sits on your red blood cells. That's the whole story, biologically speaking. Think of it the way you'd think of eye color. Two strangers on opposite sides of the planet can both have brown eyes without sharing a single recent ancestor because eye color is controlled by a handful of genes that show up independently in almost every human population. Blood type works the same way. It's a useful analogy right up until you push it too far. Eye color and blood type aren't influenced by exactly the same genetic architecture, and blood type carries real medical weight that eye color doesn't, particularly for transfusions and organ matching. But the core lesson holds. A single, common trait, controlled by a small number of genes, simply isn't built to encode thousands of years of population history. For that, you need the rest of the genome, the tens of thousands of genes, and the vast stretches of non-coding DNA between them, inherited as one long, layered record of everyone who came before you. So why does the claim about ancient Jewish blood feel true to so many people? Because it's tapping into something that is real, just not something you can find in your blood type. It's tapping into an actual scientific question that has occupied population geneticists for more than a century. Is there a genetic thread connecting Jewish communities across the world, separated for 2,000 years by exile, migration, and dramatically different host populations? That question is legitimate. Researchers have actually investigated it. And what they found is far more interesting than anything a blood type could tell you. In 2010, a team led by Dr. Harry Oster, then director of the Human Genetics Program at NYU Langone Medical Center, published a large genomic analysis in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Instead of looking at one gene, the team scanned across the genome, comparing Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and other Jewish populations against non-Jewish groups from the same regions. Oster noted that earlier generations of researchers had leaned on blood group and serum markers to argue for a shared Middle Eastern origin among Jewish populations. The same kind of thinking behind today's viral claim, just with better tools now available to actually test it. The genome-wide data showed something blood typing alone never could, that Jewish populations from different corners of the world carried a detectable shared genetic signature, layered on top of centuries of local admixture with the communities they lived among. That's a real finding. It didn't come from a blood drop matched to a tooth. It came from comparing enormous quantities of genetic data, collected with informed consent from living people, and cross-referenced against decades of population genetics research. There's an even sharper example of how this kind of research actually works, and it goes back further than Oster's study. In 1997, a research team led by Karl Skorecki, working with geneticist Michael Hammer and colleagues, published a study in the journal Nature that had nothing to do with blood type and everything to do with a single specific genetic question. Jewish tradition holds that men belonging to the Kohanim, the priestly line, descend patrilineally from a single ancestor, passed down father to son for more than 3,000 years, regardless of where their families eventually settled. Skorecki's team tested that tradition directly, comparing the Y-chromosomes, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, of men who identified as Kohanim against men from the same communities who did not. They found a shared Y-chromosome signature appearing at strikingly high frequency among Kohanim, and crucially, the pattern showed up in both Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, populations that had been geographically separated for close to 1,000 years by the time of the study. A follow-up study the next year and further research afterward estimated that the shared lineage coalesced to a common ancestor roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years in the past, placing its origin somewhere in the neighborhood of the era of the ancient Israelite kingdoms. That is what a legitimate DNA to ancestry claim actually looks like. Not you share a common blood type with 68 strangers, but a specific testable genetic marker passed down one very particular line of inheritance, checked against an oral tradition maintained across 2,000 years of dispersal, and confirmed independently in populations that had barely interacted with each other for centuries. It's precise, it's falsifiable, and it came from Y-chromosome sequencing, not a blood bag. And it gets more specific than that. In 2022, a much larger international team, led by geneticist Shai Karmi at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and population geneticist David Reich at Harvard Medical School, published one of the most detailed ancient DNA studies of a Jewish population ever conducted in the journal Cell. Their source wasn't a scattering of ancient skeletons dug up decades earlier. It was a medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany, a community that thrived between the 11th and 15th centuries, survived a massacre in 1349, and was ultimately expelled from the city in 1454, after which a granary was built directly on top of the burial ground. Centuries later, when that granary was demolished to make way for a parking lot, an archaeological rescue excavation uncovered the remains beneath it. With special permission from the local Jewish community, researchers extracted DNA from teeth that had already been recovered during that excavation and sequenced the genomes of 33 individuals. What they found inside those 33 genomes reshaped a decades-old debate. The team identified two distinct genetic subgroups buried within the same medieval cemetery, one carrying a heavier signature of Middle Eastern ancestry, likely representing Jews whose lineage traced further back through Western Europe, and another shaped more strongly by more recent population mixing. Layered underneath both groups was evidence of what geneticists call a founder effect, a moment sometime in the population's past when a relatively small number of individuals gave rise to a disproportionate share of all the Ashkenazi Jewish people alive today. That's why, centuries later, geneticists can look at a DNA sample from someone with Ashkenazi ancestry almost anywhere in the world and detect the genetic fingerprint of that same original bottleneck. None of that required a blood type. It required actual ancient genomes, actual peer review, and actual archaeological permission granted by a living community connected to the dead being studied. So here's the midpoint of this story, and it's worth pausing to lay it out plainly. One version of ancient Jewish blood, the version built around a single common blood type shared by roughly a third of the entire human species, collapses the moment you check the only relevant ancient data we have, which actually points the other direction. But a second, real version of this story exists. It's built on genome-wide data, ancient DNA extraction, and decades of peer-reviewed research into Jewish population history. And that version is one of the most well-documented case studies of long-term genetic continuity anywhere in modern human genetics. Which raises the next question. If blood type can't carry that story, why did anyone ever think it could? The answer runs through a much darker chapter of the 20th century. Long before genome sequencing existed, some researchers in the early and mid-1900s tried to use blood group frequencies to sort human populations into rigid biological categories, an approach entangled with the racial pseudoscience of the era, including attempts made under the Nazi regime to identify a distinct Jewish blood type that could distinguish Jewish people from their non-Jewish neighbors. The effort failed because it was built on a false premise. Blood type doesn't sort neatly along ethnic or religious lines. It never has. Modern genetics didn't just fail to confirm that old idea. It replaced the entire framework because the tools we use now measure something blood typing was never capable of measuring. Continuous ancestry, spread across the whole genome, not a single switch with 4 settings. That history matters here because it's the ghost hiding underneath today's viral claim. The idea that a blood type could reveal a hidden ethnic or ancestral identity isn't a new idea dressed up in modern DNA language. It's an old discredited idea wearing a new headline. The 1977 Tel Aviv study wasn't ancient population using the only method available at the time. It's the modern internet that took that data, or the concept behind it, and bent it into something it was never built to support. So what would it actually take to legitimately connect a living person's genetics to an ancient population? Not a blood draw and a guess. It takes ancient DNA extraction from skeletal remains, usually from the dense petrous bone or tooth roots, where genetic material survives best. It takes sequencing that ancient genome and comparing it, marker by marker, against the genomes of people alive today. It takes statistical modeling to determine whether the similarities are meaningful or just the ordinary background noise every human population shares. And it takes exactly the kind of institutional, peer-reviewed, community-permissioned work the Hebrew University and Harvard team did in Erfurt. Not a viral graphic claiming your blood type is a secret code. Let's be precise about what's established, what's supported, and what's simply false, because all three live inside this story at once. Established, ancient Jewish skeletal remains. From the Roman era Jerusalem region, tested in 1977, showed an ABO distribution weighted heavily toward AB and AB blood types, with type O appearing in less than 4% of the sample. Established, genome-wide studies of living Jewish populations, published in peer-reviewed journals including the American Journal of Human Genetics, have identified a detectable shared ancestry among geographically dispersed Jewish communities, layered on top of a mixture with surrounding populations. Established, ancient DNA recovered from a medieval Ashkenazi Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, published in Cell in 2022, revealed genetics subgroup structure and a founder effect signature consistent with the population history of Ashkenazi Jews today. Established, a shared Y-chromosome signature among men identifying as Kohanim, first documented in Nature in 1997 and refined in subsequent studies, appears at elevated frequency in both Ashkenazi and Sephardic priestly lineages, with estimated coalescence times pointing back roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years, disputed or unresolved. Exactly how far back the founder events behind these signatures extend, how many separate migrations contributed to different Jewish communities over time, and how much weight any single ancient sample of a few dozen individuals can bear when representing a population of many thousands. Not established, and directly contradicted by the one relevant dataset we have, the claim that O-positive blood type specifically connects modern individuals to ancient Jewish populations, The actual ancient blood typing data points toward AB and AB, not O. And biologically, a single blood type gene was never capable of carrying the kind of deep ancestral signal that viral claim is asking it to carry. Which brings us to the real reveal of this story, and it isn't the one the title implies. The shocking part was never that your blood type secretly connects you to an ancient bloodline. The shocking part is what real scientists actually found when they looked properly. A population that endured exile, expulsion, massacre, and 2,000 years of dispersal across radically different corners of the world, and still carries a detectable, traceable genetic thread linking a medieval cemetery in Germany to modern DNA samples on the other side of the planet. That's not a rumor. That's not a blood type meme. That's published, peer-reviewed, ancient DNA science, built painstakingly from actual teeth, actual bones, and actual community-permissioned research. The irony is that the true story is more remarkable than the false one. It's just quieter, harder to fit in a headline, and it doesn't let you find your own secret bloodline by checking the back of your donor card. It required geneticists, archaeologists, and a very small number of ancient skeletons that had to be handled with extraordinary care, decades apart, on 2 different continents before the picture became clear. So if you came into this video believing your OOS positive blood type meant something ancient and hidden about your ancestry, the honest answer is probably not. And if anything, the one relevant ancient dataset argues the opposite. But if you're genuinely curious about how ancient populations connect to people alive today, the real answer was never sitting in a blood bag. It was sitting in a 2,000-year-old jawbone in Tel Aviv, in a Y-chromosome passed quietly from father to son for 3,000 years, and in 30, 3 teeth pulled from beneath a parking lot in Erfurt, each one a small physical thread tying the deep past directly to the present. None of that makes for as tidy a headline as "Your blood type is a secret code." Real population genetics rarely does. It comes with sample sizes, confidence intervals, and papers that take years to pass peer review, instead of a single sentence built to travel fast. But that's also why it holds up. The Tel Aviv skeletons, the Austro genome scan, the Cohen study, and the Erfurt cemetery all point toward the same underlying reality from 4 completely different angles and 4 completely different decades of research. And not one of them needed your blood type to get there. Before you go, here's something worth sitting with. Somewhere in a lab archive right now, there are ancient remains that haven't been fully sequenced yet. Populations whose genetic story hasn't been told. What do you think the next one will reveal? Drop your guess in the comments. And if this kind of story, where the real science turns out to be stranger than the myth, is the kind of thing you want more of, you know what to do next.